The groan of the wagon wheels was the only sound that belonged to him. Everything else, the brittle snap of frozen pine branches, the low moan of air moving through the high passes, the vast, unforgiving silence of the snow, belonged to the mountains. Griffin pulled his collar higher, the rough wool scratching a chin raw from the cold. He was bone weary, the trip to town having yielded less than he'd hoped and costing more than he'd planned. Now, with dusk bleeding purple and gray across the western peaks, all he wanted was the meager warmth of his cabin, a fire in the hearth, and the familiar weight of his dog Shep at his feet. Shep whined softly from the wagon bed, a low, questioning sound. Griffin glanced back. The German shepherd wasn't looking at him, but at the lumpy pile of canvas sacks and the single crate of tinned goods he'd managed to afford. "Easy, boy," Griffin murmured, his own breath pluming white. "Almost home." But the dog whined again, more insistent this time, and shifted his heavy paws. He nudged his nose toward the largest canvas, the one covering a bale of hay. A flicker of annoyance went through Griffin. He had no time for this. The temperature was dropping with the sun, and the trail was already treacherous with ice. Still, he trusted the dog's instincts more than his own exhaustion. He pulled the horses to a halt, the sudden stillness amplifying the immense quiet. He swung himself down from the driver's seat, his boots crunching in the snow. "What is it, Shep? Found a stowaway rabbit?" He reached for the canvas, his gloved fingers stiff. He pulled the corner back, expecting to see nothing more than the pale gold of the hay. Instead, he saw white. A startling, impossible white against the grime and gray of his wagon. It was fabric, fine and clean, like a patch of fresh snow that had fallen indoors. And beneath it, there was the unmistakable shape of a person. He pulled the canvas away completely. A woman lay curled in the hay, her face turned away from him. She was small, delicate, with hair as black and glossy as a raven's wing spilling around her. She wore a simple white prairie dress, a garment so utterly unsuited for the brutal mountain winter that it looked like a shroud. For a moment he thought she was dead. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced his fatigue. He reached out a hesitant hand, then stopped. She stirred. A small, shuddering breath escaped her lips. She was alive. She was asleep. And she was Chinese, her features fine-boned and exquisite even in repose. Questions crashed through his mind, each one more urgent than the last. Who was she? How did she get into his wagon? And what in God's name was he going to do with her? He stood frozen, the biting air forgotten, staring at the impossible woman sleeping amongst his meager supplies. She woke with a gasp, her eyes flying open, dark and wide with terror. They locked onto his face, and he saw a hunted look he recognized from wild things caught in a trap. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the side of the wagon, her hands coming up as if to ward off a blow. Her lips parted, and a string of soft, sharp syllables tumbled out, a language he didn't understand, but whose meaning was perfectly clear. Fear. Griffin held up his hands, palms open, trying to show he meant no harm. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm, the way he'd speak to a spooked horse. "I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The white dress, he now saw, was smudged with dirt and had a tear near the hem. It was a dress for a wedding or a Sunday service, not for hiding in the back of a freight wagon in the dead of winter. She was young, younger than he'd first thought, barely a woman. Shep, sensing the tension, moved to Griffin's side and sat, letting out a soft, low woof. The woman's eyes darted to the dog, and a fresh wave of fear crossed her face. "He's all right," Griffin said, placing a hand on Shep's head. "He's a good boy." He kept his movements slow, deliberate. He backed away from the wagon, giving her space. The cold was beginning to seep back into his bones, a reminder of the immediate danger. They couldn't stay here. "We need to go," he said, more to himself than to her. He pointed up the trail toward the thin curl of smoke that was just visible against the darkening trees. "My cabin. It's warm," he mimed, shivering, then rubbing his hands together over an imaginary fire. She watched his every move, her expression a mixture of terror and confusion. He didn't know if she understood his gestures, but the logic of survival was universal. Here, there was only the encroaching, deadly cold. There, he offered the promise of shelter. Slowly, hesitantly, she pulled herself into a sitting position. She was shivering violently now, her teeth chattering. Her gaze flickered from his face to the dog, then to the desolate, snow-draped landscape around them. There was nowhere else to go. With a visible effort, she nodded, just once. It was a surrender born not of trust, but of desperation. Griffin felt a heavy weight settle in his gut. He was a man who craved solitude, who had built his life around the quiet predictability of his own company. This woman was a complication he could not afford, a mystery he did not have the tools to solve. But leaving her to freeze was not an option. It wasn't in his nature. He gestured for her to stay put, then walked to the front of the wagon and picked up the reins. The journey was only another mile, but it felt like 100. The cabin was little more than a single room, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. It was spare, containing only a cot, a small table with 2 chairs, a stone hearth, and shelves holding a few necessities. But it was clean, and after Griffin got the fire roaring in the hearth, it was warm. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, huddled on the far side of the room, wrapped in a thick wool blanket he'd given her. She had not taken her eyes off him since they'd arrived. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements economical and practiced. He tended to the horses, brought in more firewood, and put a pot of water on to heat over the flames. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the fragile, foreign life that had suddenly been thrust into his own. He tried not to stare, not to make her feel more cornered than she already did. Shep seemed to understand too. The dog lay down near the hearth, positioned halfway between them, a furry, watchful guardian who offered no threat. Finally, Griffin ladled some hot water into a bowl and took out a tin of beans. It wasn't much, but it was hot. He set the bowl on the table. He looked at her and gestured toward the food, then to the empty chair. She hesitated for a long moment. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the deep, instinctual suspicion warring with the gnawing hunger. He turned his back on her, pretending to busy himself with the fire, giving her the privacy to make a choice. He heard the scrape of the chair legs against the wooden floor. When he glanced over his shoulder, she was sitting at the table, eating the beans with a small wooden spoon, her movements quick and furtive, like a bird stealing crumbs. He felt a pang of something he couldn't name. It was more than pity. It was a profound sense of her displacement, her utter aloneness in the world. He was a lonely man, but his was a chosen solitude. Hers felt like an exile. He ate his own portion standing by the fire, the silence in the small cabin thick with unspoken questions. When she finished, she placed the spoon neatly beside the empty bowl and looked at him. Her eyes were still wary, but the frantic terror had subsided, replaced by a quiet, waiting exhaustion. For the first time, he spoke to her without the immediate pressure of survival. "My name is Griffin." He touched his own chest. She watched his lips, then looked into his eyes. She said nothing. He hadn't expected her to. He pointed to the cot. "You can sleep there." He then pointed to his own bedroll on the floor by the fire. He wanted her to understand she would be safe. She followed his gestures, her dark eyes unreadable. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost lost to the crackle of the fire, she spoke a single word. Lynn. It was the first piece of her she had given him. A name. The snow began to fall in earnest during the night, thick, heavy flakes that muffled the world in a blanket of white. By morning, the cabin was sealed in. Griffin knew without looking that the trail back to town was impassable. They were trapped. For how long, he couldn't say. Days, maybe a week. The realization settled on him not with panic, but with a weary resignation. He had enough food to last if they were careful, and plenty of wood. The real challenge would be sharing this confined space with a stranger who didn't speak his language and who looked at him as if he might turn on her at any moment. Lynn was awake when he rose, sitting on the edge of the cot, the wool blanket still clutched around her shoulders. Her white dress looked even more forlorn in the gray morning light filtering through the single window. He nodded a greeting and went about his morning chores, moving with a practiced slowness. He made coffee, the rich, bitter scent filling the small room. He offered her a cup, which she accepted with a quiet dip of her head. The silence between them was no longer fraught with immediate fear, but it was still heavy with caution. He spent the morning splitting firewood just outside the door, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady counterpoint to the silent snowfall. He could feel her watching him from the doorway. He worked with a steady, powerful grace, his competence on full display. This was his world, his element. He was not a man of many words, but he could provide warmth and shelter. He could keep the wilderness at bay. When he came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots, he saw she had not been idle. She had found his small sewing kit and was carefully mending the tear in her dress, her stitches impossibly small and neat. Later, as he prepared a thin stew of salted meat and potatoes, she approached the hearth and began to sweep the stray ashes with a small broom she'd found. They worked around each other in a silent, unspoken partnership. He provided the substance, the raw materials of survival, and she brought a touch of order, a quiet domesticity that the cabin had never known. That afternoon he found her looking at the worn-out elbow of his coat, which was slung over a chair. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the frayed edges. She looked at him, a question in her eyes, and held up the sewing kit. He nodded. She sat by the fire, the rough wool of his coat in her lap, and began to patch it. Shep rested his head on her knee, and she absently stroked his fur. Griffin watched them, a strange warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Trust wasn't built with words. He knew that now. It was built with shared work, with a warm meal, with the simple, steady rhythm of a day spent keeping the cold out, together. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun they could barely see through the ceaseless snow. The small cabin became their entire world. The initial tension between Griffin and Lynn slowly softened, eroding under the gentle pressure of shared routine. He learned the rhythm of her movements, the quiet way she hummed to herself while she worked. She, in turn, learned the meaning of his different silences. One evening, as the fire danced and cast long shadows on the walls, she decided to tell him. She couldn't use words, not enough of them, but she had to try. She pulled a small, intricately folded piece of paper from a hidden pocket in her dress. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was a document of some kind, covered in characters he couldn't read, but at the bottom there were two names written in English. One was hers, Lynn. The other was a man's, Mr. Alistair Croft. She pointed to her name, then to Croft's, and drew a line between them with her finger. Then she shook her head vehemently, her expression one of disgust. She said a word in her own language, sharp and bitter. Then she looked at him and said one in English. "No." She then pointed to Croft's name again and made a fist, her face hardening. She spoke another English word, one she must have heard and remembered. "Bad." Finally she mimed running, her fingers moving quickly across the wooden table, then pointed to his wagon and then to herself. The story was fragmented, but the pieces fit together with a terrible clarity. She was promised to this Mr. Croft, a bad man, and she had run away, stowing away in the first wagon she could find, which happened to be his. Griffin stared at the paper, a cold dread seeping into him. This wasn't just a lost girl. This was a runaway bride, or something like it. This Mr. Croft would not simply let her go. He would have paid for her, considered her his property, and he would be looking for her. He looked up from the paper and met her eyes. She was watching him, her expression pleading, searching his face for his reaction. Was he angry? Would he cast her out? He saw the terror returning to her eyes, the fear that he would be just another man who saw her as a transaction, a problem to be disposed of. Without a word, he reached across the table, took the piece of paper, and gently folded it. He walked to the hearth and tossed it into the flames. They both watched as it curled, blackened, and turned to ash. He turned back to her. "Mr. Croft won't find you here," he said, his voice low and steady. He knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep, but it was one he had to make. The act of burning the paper was a turning point. It was a declaration. Griffin had chosen a side, and that side was hers. The air in the cabin shifted, the last remnants of her fear dissolving into something warmer, more fragile, a tentative trust. He began to talk to her, not expecting answers, but simply to fill the silence with the sound of a calm voice. He told her about his failed attempt at gold prospecting, the small ranch he'd lost to a hard winter, the reasons he'd sought solitude in these mountains. He spoke of Shep, how he'd found the dog half-starved and abandoned on the trail 2 years prior. He didn't know how much she understood, but she listened intently, her dark eyes fixed on his face, as if she could absorb the meaning through his tone alone. She, in turn, began to share small pieces of herself. She taught him her word for water and fire and bread. She showed him how to hold his mending needle properly, her small, gentle hands correcting his clumsy grip. One afternoon he found her sketching in the frost on the window pane with her fingertip. She drew a bird, a boat with a high sail, a flower with many petals. It was a window into a world he couldn't imagine, a life lived somewhere far across the sea. The domestic routine that had been a necessity for survival now became a comfort. The cabin, once just a shelter, started to feel like a home. It was in the way she folded his blankets in the morning, the way he made sure the fire was always banked high before she woke. It was in the shared smiles over a hot cup of coffee, the easy way Shep moved between them, accepting them both as his pack. The bond between them was forged in silence and small gestures, in practical acts of care that spoke more loudly than any words. He found himself watching her, admiring the quiet resilience that radiated from her. She had faced an unknown terror and fled into an unknown wilderness, yet she met each day with a quiet dignity. Her presence had filled a void in his life he hadn't even realized was there, a deep, aching loneliness that his self-imposed solitude had never quite filled. He was no longer just a man surviving. He was a man protecting. And in protecting her, he was rediscovering a part of himself he thought he had lost forever. He was finding a reason to do more than just endure. After a week, the snow finally stopped. The world outside was transformed, buried under a pristine, silent blanket of white. The beauty of it was immense, but it also meant the trails would soon be passable. Their isolation was ending. Griffin felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. The end of the storm meant the world and all its dangers could find them again. He was outside clearing a path to the small stable when he first heard it, the faint, rhythmic creak and jingle of a sleigh. It was distant, but growing closer. Shep heard it too. The dog stood alert, ears pricked, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Griffin's hand went still on his shovel. Visitors were rare up here, and never welcome. He scanned the tree line, his eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun on the snow. A moment later it appeared. A handsome dark green sleigh pulled by two strong black horses, cutting a clean line through the fresh powder. It was a vehicle of wealth and purpose, utterly out of place in his rugged, hardscrabble world. A man sat alone in the sleigh, holding the reins. He was dressed in a fine, dark wool coat with a fur collar, his posture ramrod straight. Even from a distance, he radiated an aura of impatient authority. The sleigh pulled up 20 yards from the cabin. The man wrapped the reins and stepped out. He was tall, with a severe face and pale, cold eyes that swept over the humble cabin with undisguised contempt. He moved with the arrogant assurance of a man who believed the world belonged to him. Griffin stood his ground, his shovel held loosely in his hands, Shep growling softly at his side. He didn't need to be told who this was. He knew. It was Mr. Croft. Lynn appeared in the cabin doorway, her face ashen. She had seen him. Her hand flew to her mouth, and a small, choked sound of terror escaped her. She took a step back, melting into the shadows of the cabin, but it was too late. Croft's cold eyes had already locked onto her fleeting image. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. "So," he said, his voice cutting through the crisp air, sharp and clear. "This is the hovel you ran to. I must say, I'm disappointed in your taste." He ignored Griffin completely, his entire focus on the dark doorway where Lynn had vanished. "Come out, Lynn. The game is over." Griffin felt a cold, hard anger settle deep in his chest. He took a deliberate step forward, planting himself squarely between the sleigh and his cabin door. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice flat and even. Croft finally deigned to look at him, his gaze dismissive, as if Griffin were no more than a piece of furniture. "I am not here for you, homesteader. I am here for my property. Send out the girl." "She's not property," Griffin replied, his grip tightening on the shovel handle, "and she's not going anywhere." Croft let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Do you have any idea who you are speaking to? I have a contract, a legal, binding agreement. She belongs to me. I paid a great deal for her, and I will have what is mine." He took a step forward, his polished boots sinking slightly into the snow. Shep's growl deepened, the sound a clear warning. "Call off your mutt," Croft snapped, his eyes flashing with irritation. "I don't want to have to shoot it." He reached inside his fine coat, and Griffin knew he was reaching for a pistol. The sight of that movement, the casual threat against his dog, solidified Griffin's resolve into something as hard and unyielding as the frozen earth beneath his feet. He was a quiet man, a man who had actively avoided confrontation for years, but there were lines that could not be crossed. This was one of them. Lynn appeared in the doorway again, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a desperate fire. She stood just behind Griffin, her small hand coming to rest on his back. It was a silent plea, a statement of trust that sent a jolt of protective energy through him. He could feel her trembling, but she did not hide. She was facing her fear, and she was doing it with him. "You need to leave," Griffin said, his voice dropping lower, each word laced with a finality that could not be mistaken. "Now." "I am not leaving without her," Croft insisted, his face darkening with rage. He was a man unaccustomed to being denied anything. "You are a squatter, A nobody. You have no right to interfere." "This is my land," Griffin said simply, "and she is under my protection. That's all the right I need." The standoff was absolute. The cold mountain air crackled with tension. It was the polished arrogance of the wealthy outsider against the quiet, immovable strength of a man defending his home. Mr. Croft stared at Griffin, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. He seemed genuinely unable to comprehend that this poor, weather-beaten man would dare to defy him. "Protection?" he sneered. "What can you possibly offer her? A life of squalor in this shack? I can give her silks, jewels, a life of ease." "You can give her a cage," Griffin countered, his voice steady. He felt Lynn's hand tighten on his back, a silent affirmation. "She doesn't want your silks. She wants to be free." "She has no say in what she wants," Croft's voice rose, cracking the alpine silence. "She is bound to me. I will have the law on you. I will have you dragged out of here in chains for theft." "She's a person, not a stolen horse," Griffin said, taking another step forward. The shovel was still in his hand, but his true weapon was the unshakable certainty in his eyes. "You come one step closer to this cabin, and you'll find out just how seriously I take my responsibilities." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty appeared in Croft's cold eyes. He had expected a cowering peasant, easily intimidated. He had not expected this quiet, resolute man who stood before him like a mountain oak, deeply rooted and immovable. He looked past Griffin to Lynn, who met his gaze without flinching. The terrified girl who had fled from him was gone, replaced by a woman who had found an anchor in a storm. He saw that he had not just lost her. She had been won by another, not with money or contracts, but with something he could never offer: safety. Croft's face twisted into a mask of pure spite. He knew he was beaten, at least for today. He could not force the issue here, alone, with a determined man and his formidable dog standing in his way. But his pride would not allow for a simple retreat. "You will regret this," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Both of you." He turned abruptly, his movements stiff with anger, and climbed back into his sleigh. He took up the reins and, with a vicious snap, sent the horses lunging forward. The sleigh turned in a wide, spraying arc of snow and disappeared back down the trail, leaving only silence and the faint scent of cold leather in its wake. The immediate danger was gone. Griffin stood for a long moment, watching the place where the sleigh had vanished, his body still tense. Then, slowly, he let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He dropped the shovel. He turned to face Lynn. She was looking at him, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. They were not tears of fear, but of profound, overwhelming relief. The cabin was quiet again, the intrusion of the outside world having receded like a bad dream. The fire crackled in the hearth, a warm, comforting sound. Shep lay before it, his head on his paws, occasionally thumping his tail against the floorboards. The confrontation had changed everything. The threat had been faced and vanquished, not with violence, but with simple, moral courage. It had solidified the unspoken bond between them into something permanent and real. Lynn moved from the doorway and stood before Griffin. She reached out and gently took his hand, her fingers tracing the calluses on his palm. She looked up at him, her expression full of a gratitude so deep it needed no words. He saw in her eyes the end of her fear and the beginning of a new life, a life she would choose for herself. She spoke his name. "Griffin," her voice soft but clear. It sounded different now, not just a label, but a title, a term of endearment. He covered her hand with his other, his large, rough hands enveloping hers. "Lynn," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. The future was still a vast, unknown territory. Mr. Croft might return with the law. They had little money and faced a long, hard winter. But for the first time in a long time, Griffin didn't feel alone in his struggle. The solitude he had once sought had been replaced by a partnership he now knew he couldn't live without. He had found more than a stowaway in his wagon. He had found a reason. That evening they sat at the small table and shared a meal. It was the same simple stew as before, but it tasted richer. The silence between them was no longer a space of caution, but one of comfortable companionship. After they ate, Lynn pointed to herself, then to Griffin, and then made a gesture that encompassed the small, warm cabin. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her whole face. It was the first time he had seen her truly happy. He knew what she meant. This was home. The three of them, a man who had hidden from the world, a woman who had run from it, and a loyal dog who had waited for them both, were a family, forged in the heart of a storm. Outside, the snow-covered mountains stood silent witness, their peaks glowing in the soft light of the rising moon. The world was vast and cold, but inside the small cabin, by the light of a flickering fire, a new life had begun.